On to our second leading story, and it leads us to Cote d'Ivoire. There are mixed reactions in the country over the composition of the election body. The government is about to introduce a bill to change the composition of the Independent Electoral Commission. If the draft law is adopted by the National Assembly, the future commission will consist of 15 members instead of the usual 17. The government says the new commission will inevitably be more balanced, with representatives of the state and the ruling coalition taking 5 seats instead of the current half. But the opposition doesn't seem to be welcoming this move, Bridget.
Exactly, Lynette. What the opposition is asking for is a complete overhaul of the Independent Electoral Commission and not just a simple recomposition. Some members of this new commission are considered too close to the government. A part of civil society also regrets not having been consulted before the official announcement.
We'll try to get the reaction of the opposition regarding this bill, and to this regard we speak to President of the Ivorian Popular Front Party, Pascal Affi-N'Guessan. Pascal Affi-N'Guessan, thank you very much for joining us in the program today. So, changing the composition of the Independent Electoral Commission, this should be good news for the opposition, who have been calling for this reform for a long time, right?
Yes, this should be very good news for the opposition because, as you have been saying for several years now, we are all calling for the reform of the Independent Electoral Commission, which was at the center of a serious crisis in Cote d'Ivoire in 2010, 2011 in particular. Unfortunately, despite the negotiations we had from January to that date, unilaterally, the government has just passed a bill that is not the result of the negotiations and that does not ultimately appear to be a parallel, personal and solitary initiative. Many of your demands have been taken into account in the future bill. What is it that bothers you about it? First of all, there is this question, which is the question of the approach of the form. On the form, we do not agree. Then, there is the question of substance. In substance, the draft proposes 15 members for the Independent Electoral Commission, 7 of whom are in favor of the presidential majority, that is 47%, and only 3 for the opposition. That would be 20% of the members of the commission, and 5 for civil society, that is 30%. We consider this distribution violates the principle of balance, that would have required the 3 entities, the presidential majority, the opposition, and civil society, to be on an equal footing in order for the Independent Electoral Commission to be based on a balanced tripod. In addition, this draft does not take into account 2 other elements essential for the impartiality and independence of the Commission, namely the powers of the Commission and then the functioning of the Commission. So until then, we have noted that in its functioning and by virtue of its powers, the Commission is subordinate to the government. Most of its decisions must be endorsed by the government. We want to cut this umbilical cord because without this break, we cannot talk about an Independent Electoral Commission in Cote d'Ivoire.
And you held a press conference yesterday to denounce this bill. What is going to be your next move?
First of all, we organized this press conference to call on the government to come back to the negotiation table, since there are still many subjects to discuss, and which were recognized in the minutes that sanctions this first stage of negotiations. So the government knows about it. It has not finished the negotiations. It knows that we have not finished with the Independent Electoral Commission. It equally knows that we must talk about the Electoral Code. It knows that we must talk about the electoral boundaries, the conditions for organizing elections and electoral dispute. Therefore, there are still many issues to be resolved if the legal and institutional framework for the elections is to be improved and guaranteed peace and stability on the occasion of the general elections in 2020. For this time being, we call on the government to return to the negotiation table We hope that this call will be heeded too, because these negotiations condition peace and stability.
We have to leave it at that, Pascal, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us.